In this original text version of A Tale of Two Cities, we've clarified the difficult words and explained the key references as you go so you can stay inside the story instead of constantly reaching for a dictionary. In 30 seconds, here's what you're about to experience. A Tale of Two Cities drops you into the French Revolution, a time when a demand for justice against a corrupt aristocracy exploded into something far darker. What began as a cry for equality turned into mob rule, public denunciations, show trials, and the guillotine. This is not just history. It is a story about what happens when the desire to make everyone equal overrides every other principle, and why that pattern still matters. Book 1, Chapter 1, The Period. In this very well-known opening to his novel, Charles Dickens lists a series of opposites intended to show how extreme and contradictory the times felt. And in this case, the time is just before the French Revolution and the American Revolution, both of which took place in the late 1700s. Original text. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch or era of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity or disbelief. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period, meaning that Charles Dickens is warning people that the crazy events of 1775 could be about to repeat themselves again in 1859 when he wrote his novel. Let's continue. In short, the period was so far, or very much, like the present period, that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative or highest degree of comparison only, meaning that loud, opinionated people demanded that this period could only be described as either the best or the worst, with nothing in between. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face, meaning a beautiful face, on the throne of France. In both countries it was clearer than crystal, meaning obviously true, to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes, which is another way of saying those in power who controlled most resources and wealth, that things in general were settled forever. Before we continue, I want to let you know that I'm going to briefly summarize many paragraphs until you get a sense of what is going on in the story. Summary. It was the year 1775. England was full of superstition and spiritual revelations, just like there were in 1859 when Dickens wrote his novel. A woman named Mrs. Southcott claimed to be a prophet, and one of the king's guards even announced that London was about to be swallowed up because of her. There was also a famous hoax concerning a Cock Lane ghost, which had supposedly delivered messages by knocking on walls that was all the rage about a dozen years earlier, and it was still fresh in people's minds. In addition, new messages were arriving. The American colonies had sent demands to the British Crown and people. Dickens wryly notes that these political messages from America would turn out to be far more important to the world than any ghostly knockings from the Cock Lane chickens, which is a sarcastic jab wherein Dickens mocks the silly supernatural fads of the time. Original text. It was the year of our Lord, 1775. Spiritual revelations were conceded or granted to England at that favored or privileged period, as at this. Mrs. Southcott had recently attained her 25th or 25th blessed birthday, of whom a prophetic private in the Life Guards had heralded the sublime appearance by announcing that arrangements were made for the swallowing up of London and Westminster. Even the Cock Lane ghost had been laid only a round dozen of years after rapping out its messages, as the spirits of this very year last past, supernaturally deficient in originality, rapped out theirs. Mere messages in the earthly order of events had lately come to the English crown, or the English king and people, from a congress of British subjects in America, which, strange to relate, have proved more important to the human race than any communications yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. Summary. In the next paragraph, Dickens personifies England by metaphorically comparing it to Britannia, who is a goddess-like figure that carries a shield and trident, which is a three-pronged spear. Original text. France, less favored on the whole as to matters spiritual than her sister of the shield and trident, rolled with exceeding smoothness downhill, making paper money and spending it, meaning that France was rapidly heading toward disaster by printing money that wasn't backed by gold or silver, which eventually and always becomes worthless. Under the guidance of her Christian pastors, she entertained herself, besides, with such humane achievements as sentencing a youth to have his hands cut off, his tongue torn out with pincers, which is a metal tool, and his body burned alive, because he had not kneeled down in the rain to do honor to a dirty procession of monks which passed within his view at a distance of some 50 or 60 yards. It is likely enough that, rooted in the woods of France and Norway, there were growing trees, when that sufferer was put to death, already marked by the woodman, fate, to come down and be sawn into boards, to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it, terrible in history, meaning that Dickens is comparing fate to a silent woodcutter preparing wood to build guillotines. Summary. Around Paris there were old carts called tumbrils in farmers' barns that were dirty and pulled by animals. These carts would later be used to carry noblemen and traitors of the Revolution to the guillotines. Original text. It is likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillers of the heavy lands adjacent to Paris, there were sheltered from the weather that very day, rude carts or tumbril carts, bespattered or splattered with rustic mire, meaning rural mud, snuffed about by pigs, and roosted in by poultry, or perched in by chickens, which the farmer, Death, had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the Revolution, meaning that Dickens is imagining Death as a farmer who is already choosing carts that would later carry people to the guillotine. But that woodman and that farmer, though they work unceasingly, work silently, and no one heard them as they went about with muffled tread. The rather forasmuch as to entertain any suspicion that they were awake was to be atheistical or disbelieving in God, and traitorous or disloyal. In England, there was scarcely an amount of order and protection to justify much national boasting. Daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. Families were publicly cautioned not to go out of town without removing their furniture to upholsterers' warehouses for security. The highwayman in the dark, which refers to horse-mounted thieves who held up and stole from travelers on public roads, was a city tradesman in the light, and, being recognized and challenged by his fellow tradesmen whom he stopped in his character or alias of the captain, gallantly shot him through the head and rode away. The mail was waylaid or ambushed by 7 robbers, and the guard shot 3 dead, and then got shot dead himself by the other 4, in consequence of the failure of his ammunition, meaning that he ran out of ammunition, after which the mail was robbed in peace. That magnificent, and in this case the word magnificent is being used sarcastically, potentate, which is a person who possesses great power or authority, the Lord Mayor of London, was made to stand and deliver, or hand over all his valuables, on Turnham Green, in London, by one highwayman who despoiled or robbed the illustrious creature in sight of all his retinue, which refers to the group of people who serve or guard an important person. Prisoners in London jails, and even though it's spelled with a G, it's pronounced as jails, fought battles with their turnkeys or guards, and the majesty of the law fired blunderbusses, which is a type of gun, in among them, loaded with rounds of shot and ball. Thieves snipped off diamond crosses from the necks of noble lords at court drawing-rooms. Musketeers, who are soldiers armed with muskets, went into St. Giles, which is a poor area in London, to search for contraband or illegal goods, and the mob fired on the musketeers, and the musketeers fired on the mob, and nobody thought any of these occurrences much out of the common way. In the midst of them, the hangman, ever busy and ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition or demand, now stringing up long rows of miscellaneous criminals, now hanging a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday, now burning people in the hand at Newgate, which is a famous prison in London, by the dozen, and now burning pamphlets at the door of Westminster Hall. The burning of pamphlets was that era's form of censorship designed to suppress misinformation or disinformation or hate speech that the king and his noblemen disapproved of. Today, taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow of a wretched pilferer or petty thief who had robbed a farmer's boy of sixpence, which represents a small amount of money. All these things, and 1,000 like them, came to pass in and close upon the dear old year 1775, environed by them, or surrounded by them, while the woodman and the farmer, symbolizing fate and death, worked unheeded, those two of the large jaws, and those other two of the plain and the fair faces, trod with stir, or walked with commotion enough, and carried their divine rights with a high hand, meaning in an arrogant manner. Thus did the year 1775 conduct their greatnesses, and myriads of small creatures, the creatures of this chronicle, or written account, among the rest, along the roads that lay before them, which simply means, in the year 1775, important people and countless ordinary people, including the characters in this story, traveled the paths that were in front of them. Thank you for joining us through this chapter of A Tale of Two Cities. If you're enjoying the story, the vocabulary lessons, and the background information that makes this classic novel more coherent, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep learning together. See you in the next chapter.